So we are also going to be recording this presentation. It will be available on the Maryland Energy Administration website on our offshore wind webpage. So let's get into it. Why are we investing in offshore wind? Taking a step back, offshore wind is a great energy source because high and consistent wind speeds offshore allow offshore wind projects to produce more energy compared to land-based wind projects. This consistency in wind speed also makes it incredibly reliable as a renewable energy resource, so it can compete with traditional fuel sources. It has a capacity factor of a potential of up to 55%, which is competitive with traditional fuel sources. And as we can see by the graphics displayed, renewable energy resources are already outcompeting traditional fuel sources, with wind already breaking into the top. This is only with 15 projects approved and only one operational. Most of this is land-based wind related, and we know that offshore wind has a much higher energy potential than land-based wind. So let's look at our offshore wind market. The data displayed in front of you illustrates the offshore wind market pipeline with projects that have already been awarded offtake contracts to state mandates and planning targets. As of this spring, 12,300 megawatts or 12 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity has been awarded offtake contracts, meaning they are either in their permitting, construction, or operation phase. As you can see, the capacity already awarded is greater than the combined state mandates and planning targets for 2030, but it is less than half the combined mandates and targets for 2035, sitting at a lofty 39 gigawatts of capacity as a goal. While state mandates do not exceed 50 gigawatts by 2050, additional planning targets such as decarbonization goals double this expected market pipeline, leading us to over 100 gigawatt trajectory by 2050. All of this data comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory's 2024 Offshore Wind Market Report, which was published last week. So taking all of this information, what does this mean? It means that as the market continues to grow, it continues to push demand onto our manufacturing and maritime industries, building up those industries and creating a resurgence in American-made production across the United States to meet the demands for the industry. It opens the door for immense opportunity for our supply chain and workforce to get involved. So moving into the federal offshore wind goals, policies, and initiatives. First, let's talk about the goals. The Biden-Harris administration has developed a series of goals, policies, and initiatives relating to implementing their 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy by 2030 and 15 gigawatts of floating offshore wind by 2035. The administration has a multifaceted approach to how they're going to deploy this much offshore wind energy. The goal starts with cost reduction. The DOE has a goal to reduce the cost of fixed bottom offshore wind to $51 per megawatt hour by 2030, and to reduce the cost of floating offshore wind to $45 per megawatt hour by 2035. This goal pairs with their economic development goals to create jobs and promote climate resiliency for our coastal communities. And the federal government is trying to do this while keeping the environment free from harm. To put those cost reduction goals into perspective, that is about a 60% cost reduction from where they are right now. So moving into the federal policies that drive these goals. These policies serve as a general framework for how the federal government intends to achieve all of their offshore wind goals. It begins with regulatory frameworks. Offshore wind leasing and permitting process involves multiple agencies and legislative acts that comply with different environmental protection laws, including those under BOEM, NOAA, NEPA, and CZMA. The Biden-Harris administration also has a national target for the country to achieve 30 gigawatts of offshore wind energy, and currently has over $50 million in federal funding available for the offshore wind industry. This is under the Department of Energy Wind Energy Technology Office. This is all on top of the incentivizing tax credits that were offered to the commercial industry under the Inflation Reduction Act, where commercial developers are able to get pretty hefty tax credits for certain initiatives. Now moving on into the federal strategic initiatives. In order to accomplish this, the DOE has developed a series that they are referring to as the Now, Forward, Transform, and Connect initiatives. Each of these initiatives targets a specific challenge area that the industry is facing. The programs are intended to reduce the cost of both fixed bottom and floating offshore wind. They're intended to modernize the grid and transmission systems and to integrate offshore wind, and they're to focus on energy storage related to wind technology. These are some of the challenge areas for the states that make offshore wind expensive. So all these initiatives are intended to reduce costs and make the market more incentivizing for developers and increase offshore wind development. So that is on the federal side. Now we're going to move on to the state side. Maryland's offshore wind goals are combined with our state's greater climate and decarbonization goals. The state has a number of goals set to help us achieve our 8.5 gigawatt of offshore wind capacity by 2031 goal. The Climate Solutions Now Act called for improvements to air quality and to achieve a net zero economy by 2045. In order to do this, the state is focused on supporting the development of a robust supply chain and skilled workforce to the industry. Let's take a look at some of the policies that Maryland has implemented to do that. So some of these policies, procedures, and initiatives are related to Maryland's whole of government approach to achieving its offshore wind goals. State agencies such as the Maryland Department of Labor, Commerce, Natural Resources, General Services, GOSBA, the Governor's Office of Women's Small Minority and Business Affairs, and the Maryland Public Service Commission meet monthly to discuss offshore wind, supply chain, and workforce development initiatives related to offshore wind. Similarly, MEA collaborates with its neighboring states, Delaware, Virginia, and North Carolina, to discuss best practices, learn how to leverage each other's strengths, and develop frameworks for intrastate collaboration. We also meet regularly with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management to help the state coordinate federal and state offshore wind efforts. Moving into our initiatives, the state leads various initiatives related to offshore wind. There are state-led initiatives that coincide with these working groups discussed in the last slide. Some of these initiatives are things like a State of Maryland offshore wind website, funding research studies related to understanding our gaps in a domestic supply chain, and our workforce strengths. Okay, everyone, now that we've had a minute break to digest all of the goals, initiatives, policies related to offshore wind on the state and federal side, now we're going to talk about permitting. Permitting is something we get a lot of questions about because it tends to be something that is complicated, but I'm going to break it down for us in a way that makes it easy to digest and understand, because we do have a lot of time in this webinar, and it is not going as I'm not taking as long to get through all the information as I thought. If you have a question, please feel free to raise your hand and ask. Okay, so we're going to talk about this two-step federal and state offshore wind permitting. There is both a federal side of offshore wind permitting and a state side of offshore wind permitting. So how does an offshore wind project get approved? There's both a federal and state process. They both involve multiple steps of approval via multiple agencies, and this is to ensure due diligence when approving an offshore wind project. So a project developer must have won a lease auction in order to actually proceed with the state process. The federal process has to come first, and a developer has to be awarded a lease in order to submit an application to the state for what is known as an offtake agreement. This agreement is a contract between the state and an offshore wind generator or project developer, where the state says they will purchase the energy. So that is included by the yellow dotted line between leasing and application submission. So going into the federal permitting process, the bottom timeline, I'm sure you all have seen before. This is the timeline that's used by BOEM. For the purpose of synthesizing this information, I've put together a timeline on the right that goes through the same steps but condenses them. So we have the planning and analysis stage, the leasing stage, the site assessment stage, and then the construction and operations stage. So what does this really look like? First, we're going to talk about the planning and analysis phase. So planning and analysis. Step one is planning and analysis. Under this step, areas that are suitable for offshore wind development are identified. Areas that may be conflicted due to environmental, commercial fishing, shipping, or any other reasons are also identified at this time. These areas are identified via a request for information where BOEM requests public input and comment about the call areas. During this time, BOEM conducts environmental compliance reviews and consults with stakeholders, tribes, state and federal government agencies. And eventually these lease areas are determined and prepared to be auctioned. This is a multi-step process that starts with the request for information, essentially asking the industry and the states if offshore wind development is something that they're even interested in. Then it moves into a call where they take a big swath of potential ocean energy space to develop offshore wind. And then they continue to break it down until you get into an area ID, wind energy area, and then finally they conduct a proposed sale notice and then a final sale notice indicated here by this little blue asterisk. So once they're through the planning and analysis phase and they have auctioned and they're getting prepared to auction off the lease area, we move into the step of leasing. The leasing phase results in the issuance of a commercial wind energy lease. It is a competitive process, and once the leasee wins the auction, they do have exclusive rights to seek approval from BOEM to develop offshore wind in that area. It should be noted that at this step in the process, they do not have the right to do any construction of any facilities. They only have the right to request permitting approval by BOEM to potentially develop offshore wind in the future. It is all contingent on multiple steps of approval by BOEM. So this is the BOEM offshore wind energy leasing schedule. We have 2024 up to 2029 listed here. We have Central Atlantic 1, which was leased August 14th, 2024. It was 2 weeks ago. We had a lease auction where Equinor won the lease area A2 and Virginia Power and Energy Company, Dominion, won auction area or lease area C. I will go a little bit more in depth into that in a later slide. But here we see this blue line. This is for an additional Central Atlantic lease area to potentially increase our offshore wind capacity in the Central Atlantic. BOEM is just initiated this process and they are in the call for information nomination stage. I will go into more information about this a little bit later, but the plan is to auction or lease those spaces between 2025 and 2026. This line indicates it could be anywhere between those times, but the goal would be by mid-2026. Now moving on to the site assessment phase. Once a leasee has won the auction, leasees are required to develop a site assessment plan. The assessment plan must include a detailed proposal for the construction of a meteorological tower for them to collect data on the lease area. Under this stage, they will also conduct environmental and wildlife-related site characterization surveys and studies. They are required to submit all of this to BOEM, and BOEM may approve with modifications, or disapprove the leasee's site assessment plan. The leasee or developer has to have an approved site assessment plan prior to moving on to the next phase. So if BOEM approved with modifications, the developer would be required to make those modifications. If it was disapproved, the developer would have to redo their site assessment plan if they want to continue the process in order to get it approved. So the site assessment plan includes geophysical surveys, environmental surveys, different wind speed surveys, all of these things that they have to report to BOEM. And the site assessment plan is very, very long, very comprehensive. So once they have an approved site assessment plan, they can move on to the construction and operations phase. Under this stage, the developer is required to submit a construction and operations plan. The construction and operations plan, also known as the COP, contains a detailed plan for the construction and operations of the project. It is also a very long, very dense document that has a lot of data in it. And once they receive the COP from the developer, BOEM will conduct a very thorough environmental and technical review of the COP, and they will either approve it with modifications or disapprove the COP. And after they've approved the COP and prior to construction, the developer must submit a facility design report and fabrication and installation report to the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. And not until they've received approval by the BSEE will they receive the record of decision by BOEM and be able to begin construction. So they have to complete all of those steps prior to a record of decision being given to the developer. So before we move into the Maryland offshore wind permitting process, did anyone have any questions about that stage? I will also be taking questions at the end, or you can put your question in the chat. Larissa?
I had a quick question. You mentioned that the site assessment plan was very comprehensive. On average, how long would you say that process takes?
So thank you. That's a really great question. All of these processes can take between 1 to 2 years to be completed. Most developers have already tried to get these documents or get some of this information together, but information from the site assessment plan will take time because it's related to environmental surveys, geospatial and geophysical surveys of the ocean floor. They have to do their due diligence to make sure they are not impacting any wildlife, and if there will be wildlife anywhere in the ocean, that they have to have mitigation and management efforts so they do no harm to the environment or mitigate and manage the harm so it's very, very little, and they have to have comprehensive plans of how they intend to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larissa. So moving into the Maryland offshore wind permitting process. So once a developer acquires a lease area, they are eligible to apply to a state procurement process or a state offtake agreement. So for the state of Maryland, this is a 5-step process that begins with a submission of an application. So this is the timeline for getting an offshore wind project approved. First begins with application submission. Then the Maryland Public Service Commission will go and will review the application for administrative completeness. This will be a high-level review to determine, positive benefits to the state, ratepayer impacts, that kind of thing. They will, once they determine that application is eligible to move forward, they will open a 120-day application period. They have a 120-day application period where they will be doing different stakeholder engagement meetings to explain the process and make sure there is transparency in it. Then they will hold public hearings. After the public hearings and a comment period of those, they will have a final evaluation and then finally an OREC award decision. As you can see, this is a long process that has, 6-month periods, 1-month period, 3-month period. This at minimum takes about a year to do. So first is application submission. An offshore wind developer must submit an application to the Maryland Public Service Commission for approval for their offshore wind project. The Maryland PSC will then determine that it meets their minimum criteria or not. And if it does meet the minimum criteria, they will open an application period for 120 days to instill competition to see if there are other developers in the area who are interested in that lease area, in developing in that lease area in the area as well, or interested in an offtake agreement with the state. The state only has so much that they will, contribute to an offtake agreement. So they want competition between developers. So upon receipt of all their applications, within 30 days, they'll determine if it meets the criteria or not. And then after this high-level review and public hearings, there will be a full evaluation that is extremely thorough with qualitative and quantitative evaluations by PSC staff. So going into the high-level PSC review, what are some of the things that they're looking at? Really things like ratepayer impact. We want to make sure that our ratepayers are protected. Projects also have to comply with Maryland statute and ratepayer protections. Maryland has one of the highest ratepayer protection caps. This is, intended to save our ratepayers the high costs that could come from investing in renewable energy prior to getting that economies of scale. So the intention of the evaluation is to find the lowest cost to ratepayers. For example, our cap is no more than $1.50 per month, which is in 2012 dollars, which equates to $1.92 today. So no more than $1.92 can be, contribute to a ratepayer's bill each month for offshore wind energy. In addition to that, the PSC looks at the overall project plan. Is it feasible? Is it realistic? How does it provide Maryland with economic benefits? If it does provide economic benefits, what are they? What is the environmental impact? How does the project developer intend to mitigate environmental risks? And lastly, will the project help the state's decarbonization goals? So at a very high level, these are some of the criteria and things that the Public Service Commission is looking for and looking at when they're considering if a project should move forward. If the PSC determines that a project meets the preliminary requirements, they will conduct evidentiary hearings to gather feedback from Maryland constituents. Prior to these hearings, the PSC will host a series of meetings to answer stakeholder questions regarding the application and the application process. These hearings are publicly available on the PSC's YouTube channel, and they discuss things like economic impacts, total project costs, capacity factors, external market factors, and the OREC pricing schedule prior to them making a decision. And then after the evidentiary hearing, the PSC will open a 30-day public comment period to document feedback from stakeholders. Okay, then we get into the actual evaluation. So once the evidentiary hearings are completed, the PSC will do a deep dive into the evaluation of an offshore wind project. It will look at both qualitative and quantitative criterion and take a very critical look at the project to determine whether it should be approved. Some of the qualitative criterion are things like environmental and community benefits, small business engagement, and the OREC pricing schedule. Some of the quantitative criterion are things like projected ratepayer impacts, ratepayer analysis, long-term effects on capacity markets, and the impact to small businesses in the state. So after 120 days of evaluation, the PSC will make their final decision. Should they choose to award a project, they will execute a memorandum of understanding that contains some of the following information: provisions that the project developer will comply with the requirements of the agreement, requirements of statute, engage with MBEs, and really anything else that the PSC determines to be appropriate. In previous approved projects, some of these additional criteria were items that the developer put into their applications. So things like supply chain investments, facility commitments, U.S. Wind committed to implementing the Sparrows Point Steel facility, and that is part of their OREC agreement that they committed to doing that. So then looking at the OREC pricing schedule, I know that this has been an area that folks are really interested in learning more about. So our offshore wind renewable energy credit pricing mechanism is structured as a fixed OREC pricing schedule. That means that the developer receives a fixed offshore wind renewable energy credit at a predetermined price per megawatt of production. So how this works is offshore wind generators, or the developer, they sell electricity directly into the wholesale PJM market. That money goes into an escrow account. Electricity suppliers purchase ORECs. The escrow account pays the developer for their fixed price OREC. Any revenues from this move to a distribution utility who distributes that cost back to ratepayers. Ratepayers, as a reminder, are paying for some of this project with a ratepayer impact cap of no more than $1.50 in 2012 dollars, which is $1.90 nowadays. That is the most that ratepayers can be charged for this. Residential ratepayers. Commercial ratepayers can be charged 1.5% of their bill, and that is the max. Okay, now we're going to move into some of the current events. So things like the U.S. Wind project overview, Central Atlantic lease area status updates, and what else is going on with the federal leasing process. So going into some permitting status updates, we have BOEM's timeline back on here. So this is the beginning process, the planning and analysis. Then we have the leasing process, site assessment, and then construction operations. And then once they have the COP approved, this is when they'll actually do construction, installation, and then operations for 20 years. And then they'll have a decommissioning after the end of their contract. So U.S. Wind has been going through their permitting process with BOEM since they were approved their projects back in 2017 for their round one Marwin 1 project, and 2021 for their Momentum Wind project. They have been applying for these permits jointly as their Maryland offshore wind projects as a whole to try and streamline their approval process. They are currently right here. They're getting their COP approved. They have submitted their construction operations plan. BOEM has reviewed it, and they're waiting for the BSEE, the Bureau of Ocean Safety, Energy, and Environment, to make their final review prior to submitting the record of decision. The record of decision typically takes between 30 and 60 days to be received. So we expect or anticipate the record of decision for U.S. Wind's project to be anywhere from early September to mid-October. So U.S. Wind is here and Equinor is right here. They have just been granted their lease area in the lease auction that was held August 14th of 2024. They now hold lease area A2, which is, I don't want to get it wrong, 24 nautical miles off the shore. I have a whole slide dedicated to that as well. So going into U.S. Wind status update, they hold this lease area right here for their Marwin and Momentum Wind projects, two projects that are really being combined as one, or messaged as one right now. So collectively, with those two projects, their project capacity is at 2.2 gigawatts. That's what they estimate that they will be able to produce as their nameplate capacity. They have completed their federal environmental and technical review requirements, and they are now awaiting the record of decision. If they are approved, U.S. Wind may begin construction of their project. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, now moving on into the Central Atlantic lease auction. On August 14th of 2022, so about 2 weeks ago, BOEM held an offshore wind energy lease sale for 2 areas on the outer continental shelf of the Central Atlantic. The auction total netted $92 million for the federal government. In these provisions, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management included a provision for something called bidders credits, where a project developer could say that out of their auction price, they would like to be some of that funding to be credited towards some of their supply chain initiatives. So developers are able to receive an offshore wind bidders credit for things like workforce development initiatives or commitments to participate in a regional fisheries compensation fund. The compensation fund is intended to provide relief to commercial fishing industry that's been impacted by offshore wind development. And that is still something that's in the process of being developed. So lease area A2 was awarded to Equinor. It is 26 nautical miles from shore. It is this little orange lease area right here. It's over 100,000 acres, which means that it has a potential capacity to provide between 1.8 to 2 gigawatts of offshore wind. To put that into comparison, that is, pretty comparable to some of our traditional fuel industry facilities, such as nuclear or others. So lease area C1, located right here off the coast of Virginia, is 35 nautical miles from shore. It was the auction winner was Virginia Power and Electric Company, also known as Dominion. This lease area is a bit bigger than A2, meaning that it has a higher capacity potential of around 3 gigawatts of energy. So now BOEM has initiated round 2 of additional Central Atlantic leasing and commercial offshore wind development. So they finished their first lease process for the Central Atlantic, and they're starting a second one right now. So on August 21st, last week, BOEM announced a call for information and nominations for a second offshore wind sale in the Central Atlantic. The call area is over 13 million acres, and it stretches all the way from Delaware to North Carolina. BOEM has initiated a 60-day comment period to garner feedback from stakeholders. And throughout this time, BOEM will be hosting various in-person meetings across the region. One will be in Ocean City on September 10th at the Convention Center. That's my understanding. And the second lease process is intended to build off the first Central Atlantic lease process, which resulted in the auction on August 14th. And this this call area is this entire stretch on the Central Atlantic. So as we talked before, the call for information nomination uses a very vast ocean space to say we're going to look at all of this ocean space to deem which areas could be suitable for offshore wind development. BOEM knows that not all of these areas, not everything in this area will be suitable for offshore wind development. And they know that there will be areas that are conflicted due to environmental concerns, fishing concerns, shipping, and other ocean uses. So this swath of area is not all going to be leased. We anticipate it will be cut down quite dramatically, just because it is 13 million acres. Not all of it's going to be used, but the intention of doing this is to really understand where offshore wind could be deconflicted so that we can reach our energy goals. I did see a question related to the auction prices. So if we go back to the auction prices being vastly different between the two, this is really because of the difference in market. So Virginia Power and Electric Company is also Dominion Energy. The state of Virginia has a regulated energy market. So Dominion is the utility and supplier, and also can be an offshore wind developer. So they have a more streamlined process that allows development to be a little bit more seamless. So this area was not as much in competition as lease area A, because offshore wind developers knew there would be challenges with working with Dominion, since they have a streamlined process already. Because Dominion has the ability to be a developer and the utility and distributor, they have a very streamlined process for implementing offshore wind, and it's just a little bit more simple in their end. However, our lease area had a lot of competition, which is actually very beneficial to us here in Maryland and then also Delaware. It instills competition, and it is a good sign for second Central Atlantic lease process, meaning that other developers will likely be wanting to participate in our offshore wind market, which then provides a lot of economic development opportunities and workforce development opportunities. So lease area A is right here. It is 26 nautical miles offshore from Maryland. So with that, that is the end of my presentation. I thank all of you for attending and participating this morning. I would like to open it up to any questions that folks have related to offshore wind. Anything that I covered, anything that I didn't cover, please go ahead and raise your hand or use the chat function. Don't higher auction prices lead to higher eventual costs for consumers? That is a good point, and it is something that the state considers. This was actually the intention of incorporating the bidders credits initiative. Having bidders credits allows developers to get credited for some of the initiatives that they're going to implement on the state side. It helps them move through the permitting processes more streamlined, and it allows them to offset some of those really high costs and help us in the United States develop our supply chain and workforce by taking those investments and using them in our state or our region. So that's a really good question, Steve. And that is the way that BOEM and the state are trying to offset that challenge. Okay, I see a question that says, where in the process is it determined how much power goes to Delaware versus Maryland on the new lease area? I asked this question wondering how the additional August auction helps towards our state's 8.5 offshore wind goal. So the offshore wind goal is related to our offtake agreements. So while we are going to be interconnected for U.S. wind is likely going to be interconnected somewhere between Maryland and Delaware, and we have a requirement that offshore wind projects have to be interconnected from on the Delmarva Peninsula, so anywhere Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, so it could be interconnected into any of those spaces on Delmarva. This, diffusion or distribution of energy is all done by PJM. We're all interconnected into the same grid, but when it comes to how it helps us achieve our goal is related to our offtake agreements, so our OREC contracts. U.S. wind has a 2 gigawatt capacity, so we have 2 gigawatts covered of our 8.5 gigawatt goal, and Equinor could produce up to 2 gigawatts. So we are about halfway to our goal if Equinor chose to participate in Maryland's offtake agreement, OREC program, and move forward with a state procurement. So where do price subsidies come for developers? Federal or state money? So there really aren't a lot of subsidies available for developers. It really is a free market system. Developers are required to purchase the auction area and do all of the due diligence, environmental and technical surveys of the lease area. In other parts of the world, like in Europe, the government might be doing the environmental surveys and offsetting that cost for developers. We are not doing that. Instead, we offer things like the different tax credits that were available in the IRA. There is the ITC and another one that related to manufacturing and construction. Those are intended to help the developers offset the costs related to implementing their projects. So another question is, what is the status of Skipjack and BOEM's timeline? So if we go back to BOEM's timeline, let's see where they are. Hold on. So in BOEM's timeline, they are okay. So Ørsted had a lease granted. They are in the same process. They are at their construction and operations plan, although they no longer have an offtake agreement with the state of Maryland, and they have no offtake agreement with any state. The challenge of not having an offtake agreement means they can't proceed with BOEM's process. To proceed with BOEM's process in the construction operations plan, they need to have approvals for where they're going to be interconnecting. They need to have approvals for where they're going to be constructing their project, all of that. So Ørsted, when they pulled out of their offtake agreement, their OREC agreement with Maryland, they lost that commitment that Maryland would be purchasing their energy. So they are at kind of a stuck point right here until they figure out what they're doing with their project. They have publicly said they are restructuring their project. Currently, that is all we have the knowledge of what they're doing with their project. Steve, I will absolutely make these slides available to participants on this webinar. These slides will also be available on our Maryland Energy Administration website. This recorded meeting will also be available on that website. All of this information will be public and be available to everyone. Are there any other questions related to offshore wind, our permitting process on either the federal or state side, or anything about current events that I can provide some insight into? Okay, well, if there are no other questions at this time, you may feel free to reach out to either myself. Again, I'm Emma Stoney. I'm the Wind and Water Energy Program Manager here at MEA. I'm joined here by my colleague, Layla Horif. Thank you, Layla, for helping everything with the presentation. Layla is our Wind and Water Energy Specialist. Either of us can be contacted at our email or phone number here. And please feel free to reach out should you have any questions. This is the first of a 3-part webinar series. Tomorrow we will be discussing supply chain and workforce opportunities, specifically getting into the different types of industries and specific jobs and careers that are available in offshore wind, and trying to provide some transparency and insight into how folks, both individuals and businesses, can get into the supply chain. On day 3, we will be talking about specific Maryland MEA incentives and funding available to businesses, specifically emerging businesses and workforce organizations in the state, to help provide offshore wind relevant curriculum, different certification and apprenticeship opportunities, and help businesses offset some of the costs that allow them to pivot into the industry. All of those you can register on the same document you registered for this one on. And with that, I thank everyone for your participation and engagement. And again, all of these slides will be publicly available. I really appreciate everyone's participation. Thank you all.